Hey everybody, I'm Mark. Welcome back to Summit. We're taking a look at the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time. If I looked at my 9-year-old son and I said, go plug in that, whatever, Xbox, right? He goes over, he takes the plug, plugs into the wall. And I said, now, where does the power come from? He'd say, the wall, right? So where's the power come from? He might say the outlet, right? The outlet to the wall, okay. But where does the power come from? And at 9, he doesn't understand engineering, architecture, even if he's a bright kid, he might go to the next step and say, okay, well, there's power to the house. Where does the power come from? I guess the power comes into the house from the city. Where does the power come from? Well, if he really gets thoughtful, well, there's probably a power station or a grid that sends power throughout, all the different cables to the city, to the house, to the outlet, to the Xbox. But you see, the point is, when you ask a question, for most of us, we don't really consider where power really resides, where it comes from. We live in a world, a society, we live in a civilized society, here in the United States. Well, sometimes it's civilized, where you say, okay, there's a system of government, there's authority, there are laws and ordinances. There's basically a way to live, an acceptable way to live. If you break that law, you go to jail, right? But ultimately, power belongs to the people. Power belongs to the government. Power belongs to the voting process. Yes and no. But that's man-made power. That's earthly power. Where does ultimate power reside? Where does authority come from? In the first reading, we're going to hear about this guy, Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was a king in Persia when God's people were away and enslaved and living in exile, right? And God comes to this Persian king and says, let my people go. Send them back. Move it, go. Okay, enough's enough. Okay, been a long time now. They've been in slavery. Send them home. And Cyrus has this power, this authority, because he's in charge of the biggest empire in the world at the time. But truthfully, this just shows us again that he doesn't really have the power. God has the power. He's telling the most important guy, most powerful man on the planet, go do this. And he acquiesces. He goes and does it, right? So even though he's in this prominent position, the ultimate power still belongs to God. He'll allow people to be in seats of power, positions of power on earth at different times, even if they're not good people. But ultimately, the power, don't never forget, always resides with God. We're going to hear in the second reading, Paul's going to talk about himself, Silvanus, Timothy. And he's going to be talking to one of the churches he's writing to. And again, even though Paul and Timothy, who's a bishop and one of his traveling companions, although they're in a position of power, sort of a seat of power, he's reminding everybody that he's not the one. Jesus is the one. Okay? He has a lot of followers. He has a lot of people who are discipled by him, a lot of people who look up to Paul. It would have been very easy for Paul to be like, yep, I'm awesome. I am so good. Paul didn't do that. Paul constantly pointed back to the true source of the true power, which was Jesus Christ himself. In the gospel, the Pharisees, in a desire to show their power, because they're religious leaders, right? They're these really learned men, these know-it-alls, constantly trying to trip up Jesus, as we've seen the last couple of weeks in the readings. We'll see the next couple of weeks. Pharisees constantly trying to get him in a verbal trap, a war of words. And they say, hey, see this coin? Whose image is on this coin? Caesar's. Okay, so should we bow to Caesar or bow to God? And they're trying to get Jesus to trip up, where he kind of breaks the law, right? And says, oh, you have to be allegiant to Caesar or be allergic to God. But they're trying to get him in trouble. And Jesus flips the whole thing on them again in this famous parable. He's like, listen, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, render to God what's God's. Listen, you're going to have to live underneath earthly authority and governments and stuff like that. Hey, you're going to have to do that. It's just part of it. But it doesn't mean that he's more powerful than God. So pay your taxes, whatever, but give your hearts to God. Give your money to Caesar. Give your hearts to God. And this is really important because Jesus keeps trying to show us the difference between earth and heaven, right? Living for earth and living for heaven. Authority is a funny word. The actual root word of authority means author's right. And God, as we hear in Acts of the Apostles, is the author of all life. He's your author. He's my author. He wrote you into existence. The reason you're here and breathing is because he wrote you into existence through your parents, but he wrote you into existence. So God has the ultimate authority, author's right. He has the right to do whatever he wants, to write whatever he wants. And what he wants is for you and I to live like good citizens, certainly, obey the laws, certainly the ones that are moral. But also he wants us to understand that there's a bigger law, a divine law that supersedes all human law. And he wants us to understand and remember that it's about him, not about the world, him. It's not about other positions of authority, other kingdoms and kingships on earth. No, it's about him. He's the one. He's the authority. And that's why in the first reading, we're going to hear about King Cyrus, who has all the power. In the second reading, where St. Paul has a lot of power, but he relinquishes it and says, no, it's about Jesus. And then in the gospel, where the Pharisees are clutching for power, grasping for power, they're trying to point to the power of Caesar. And Jesus again asserts and reminds us, no, you know what? It's not about the outlet or about the power grid or about the plant in town that sends the power to the house. The ultimate power is solar power because it comes from the sun.